Testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing, 1, 2, 3. My father was getting better. In 1917, the First World War broke out. I remember we couldn't get sugar because it was rationed. We had to go to the firehouse to get sugar, and we had to stand in line. We had a card, and each family was allowed a certain amount of sugar. When they ran out of the sugar, they would give us corn and brown sugar. In January 1917, my father said we were going to move to Winslow, New Jersey. What I don't remember is that back in 1913, my dad had bought a 6-acre farm with a large barn. The barn was bigger than the house. The house had 5 rooms. My mother had an uncle and some cousins out in Winslow. But after my dad bought the house, he leased it for 5 years to a man, James Burton. When he saw he wasn't getting any better and he could not work anymore, he and my mother decided to move to Winslow Junction. So in April of 1918, they packed our furniture in a boxcar and we moved to Winslow Junction. We went by train. When we got to the station, we had a Boston Bulldog. They wouldn't let me ride the passenger car with the dog, so I had to ride the baggage car with the dog. It took us about 6 hours to get to Winslow. Just when we got there, we stayed at their uncle's house for 3 days. That's how long it took for our furniture to arrive. So the furniture arrived. My uncle had a team of white horses, which he took the furniture out of the boxcar and put it in our house. I didn't like the place. There wasn't any houses nearby. There was a big brickyard that made all kinds of fancy bricks. There was a large hotel at Winslow Junction. He was very busy at the station. The First World War was on and the station was always filled with soldiers and people. In those days there was no buses or cars. If you had to travel, you had to go by train. At Winslow Junction there was the Reading, the Pennsylvania, and the Central Railroad. All at Winslow Junction. The Central ran from New York to Atlantic City and Bridgeton, New Jersey. The Pennsylvania and Reading ran from Philadelphia to Atlantic City. I was 11 years old at the time. I brought my shoe shine box with me from Newark, New Jersey. So I went to the station and shined shoes. I was getting 5 cents a shine, and I was doing well. I would shine all day. My uncle had plowed our ground, and he showed my mother how to plant the farm. My dad couldn't help. He was too sick. We managed to live the best we could. I worked hard at shining shoes until school started in September. Then I had to go to school. I was in the 6th grade. After school, I could go and shine shoes until 9 or 10. Then I would go home. The station was about a half mile from our house. The people that worked at the station were very nice, and I liked them a lot. They had kerosene lights around the station, and when I wasn't busy, I would help the man fill the kerosene lights. He would give me 25 cents a week. His name was Tony. Everything went well till Sunday, October 13, 1918 at 10. He never was a teenager. Everything went well until Sunday, October 13, 1918. I was at the Winslow Junction station shining shoes when my brother Joe came running. He was crying. He was only 9 years old. I said to hurry up and come home. Mom said Dad had died, so I picked up my shoe shine box and ran home to find all my brothers and sisters and mother crying. I went near my father, and he was stiff and he wasn't breathing. He was dead. I started to cry. What were we going to do now? We were 5 boys and a girl. I was the oldest boy, and I was only 11 years old. We lived 3 miles from the town of Hamilton, New Jersey. So I told my mother I would go to see Archie Boardman at Penny Tower. I knew Mr. Archie Boardman, and I thought that he could help me. So I went to see Mr. Boardman, and I was crying. I told him what had happened, that my father had died and we didn't know what to do. I told him that my father had worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad for 16 years in Newark, New Jersey as a track walker from Newark to Elizabeth, New Jersey. So he told me to sit down and stop crying, and that He would call the main office of the Pennsylvania Railroad in Jersey City. They called the main office and they looked up my father's record. After about a half an hour, they wired back. They said to call an undertaker and have him take care of the body. They would pay for the burial. Mr. Boardman called an undertaker in Hamilton by the name of Mr. Jones. He made all the arrangements. He told me to go home and wait for Mr. Jones, and if I had any trouble, let him know. I was feeling better to know Mr. Boardman went out of his way to help me, and I didn't know what to do to thank him. Without Mr. Boardman, I don't know what I would have done. He was such a nice man. He used to take care of the switches in the tower of the Pennsylvania Railroad. I knew him from shining shoes at the station. He lived in Elm, New Jersey, and he rode a bicycle from home to the station every day. It was about 2.5 miles. So I thanked Mr. Boardman and went home. It was about 12 noon on Sunday, October 13, 1918. We were all home crying. The house was about 50 feet from the road on a little hill. The road was a little dirt road. From our window, we could see down the road about a half mile. I stood by the window looking out for Mr. Jones. My father was on the cot of the front room. Downstairs, he used to sleep downstairs because he couldn't climb the stairs to the second floor. He had been very sick, and at the time in 1918, the epidemic of the flu was going on and a lot of people were dying. So about 1 p.m., Mr. Jones arrived with a Dodge hearse. He came in the house and looked at my father. Then he went out and backed the Dodge up to the porch. He came back in with a suitcase. He told my mother and brothers and sister to go in the kitchen. He locked the door. He came all alone, so he made me stay in the room and help. I will never forget, as long as I live, how he tore the shirt off my father and made me hold it, his right arm up high. He took a razor blade and cut under my father's armpit and pulled out his veins. He had a gallon of some kind of stuff, and he took a syringe and put a lot of it in my father's vein. Then he tied his veins back. We went out in the back of the hearse and we got a long basket and brought it inside. Him and I put my father in the basket and we pulled the basket out to the porch. We put it in the hearse. Then he came back in the house and he told my mother he would let her know when he would be ready to bury my father. Then he left. We all went back in the kitchen and cried. We didn't know what to do. We were alone. We didn't know anybody. The only people my mother knew were her uncle and cousins. They lived about a mile away, and our house was surrounded with woods. We were scared to death. My mother didn't know what to do, so she said she would go to her cousin's house and see what he could do. So she went to her cousin's house and talked to him. He couldn't help. He had a couple of his children sick with the flu. The flu had taken a lot of lives in the town of Hamilton. There was only 2 undertakers, Mr. Jones and Mr. Prash, and they were very busy. At the time, Mr. Jones had 16 bodies in his place. They couldn't get caskets fast enough to bury the dead. In the meantime, my mother went to Hamilton. She used to clean house for a man named Mike Vitale, and she told him about my father, and that I was 11 years old and I had shining shoes. He knew it, and that I was shining shoes at Winslow Junction Station. He told her to send me to see him and he would try and help us. So the next morning I went to see Mr. Vitale. He was very nice and he gave me a job shining shoes in his shoe repair shop. I used to make new handmade shoes. When I wasn't busy shining shoes, I would help cut the soles of old shoes and sweep up the place. I kept busy. My mother made me quit school and I went to work for Mike Vitale. I had to walk to Hamilton and back home 3 miles each way. I don't know how my mother found out, but she told me that on a Monday, 16 days after my father had died, that we had to go to Hamilton. Mr. Jones, he was going to bury my... Well, so my mother and I walked to Hamilton to Mr. Jones' funeral parlor. We got there about 9 a.m. and he had my father laid out in his front room and sat there about half hour asleep. Mr. Jones had the hearse out in front on Bellevue Avenue. He went out and got 2 policemen and a man, and they came in and carried the casket and put it in the hearse. The town of Hamilton was very small at the time, and they had only 4 policemen, and they were volunteer policemen. My mother and I got in the front seat of the hearse with Mr. Jones, and we drove to the cemetery on a white horse bike about 3 miles from Hamilton. When we got to the grave, there was a grave open right alongside of the road. Mr. Jones stopped the hearse right near the open grave. We got out, and there were two men in the graveyard. They were grave diggers. Mr. Jones called them over, and the two men, Mr. Jones and myself, took the casket out of the hearse and put it alongside of the hole and left it there. My mother and I got in the hearse with Mr. Jones, and we drove away. I still don't know if my father was put in the grave or not. The two men may have just pushed the casket in the hole and covered it up because there wasn't any ropes or anything there. I don't know how two men can put a casket down in a 6-foot hole by themselves. It still worries me to think that we left the casket by the open hole with the two men and we drove away. Mr. Jones took a road back from the cemetery by the name of Old Forks Road. When we came to a road between two railroad tracks about 2 miles from Hamilton, he let my mother off and she was still crying. She walked home from there all alone. I went with Mr. Jones to Hamilton, Mr. Breathers to work. I told Mike Breather that I just came from the graveyard, Mr. Jones, and that my mother walked home from Murphy's Crossing. So he felt bad and he said I should have walked home with my mother. So he told me to go home with my mother. He told me to go home to be with my family. So I went home. I had to walk home. There was no other way. If you had to walk, or if you were lucky, you may get a ride by someone going by with a horse and wagon. Back in 1918, there wasn't too many cars, and it was 3 miles from our house to Hamilton, and about 12 miles from Winslow Village. When I got home, my mother and my sister and my brothers were all sitting in the kitchen. We didn't know what we were going to do. My mother was about 36 years old. My sister was 15. I was the oldest boy. I was 11 years old. We were all alone on a 6-acre farm, and we didn't know anything about a farm. My mother's uncle lived about 1 mile away. He had showed us how to plant a farm in April when we came to Winslow, but now it was October, and we had no money in winter. So what were we going to do? We had to have money for kerosene lights and flour, salt, sugar, cooking oil. We had no electric. We had kerosene lights. We had a wood stove to cook on and to heat the house in winter time. The house had 5 rooms and a shed that we had hand pump in. 3 bedrooms upstairs and outhouse. She had a pig pen and chicken coop and a shed with oven and big barn. The barn was bigger than the house. We had to have wood for the stove so we could cook and keep warm. So my brothers and I got the axe and went in the swamp along the side of the house, and we chopped the trees down. We had a large handsaw, and we sawed them into small pieces so they would fit the stove. We soon had wood to cook and keep warm. My mother was a very strict Catholic. She would walk to church every Sunday morning. The superintendent of the brickyard, his wife was Catholic, and he had a car. He had to go past our house to take his wife to church. So when he would see my mother walking, he would pick her up. The Sunday after my father died, they picked my mother up, and she told him that my father had died. He asked her, "How old is you, oldest boy?" My mother told him I was 15 years old. So he said, "How big is he?" My mother said, "He's a big boy." So he told my mother to put a long pair of pants on me and send me to see a man by the name of Chewy. He was in charge of the mules and the horses in the brickyard, and he would talk to Chewy. He would take care of me. So when my mother came home from church, she told me the good news. She went to my uncle's house and borrowed a pair of long pants. She fixed them so I could wear them. The next morning was Monday. So at 6 a.m. I went to the brickyard. This was about the last Monday in October 1918. My mother had told Mr. Rouse I was 15 years old, but I was only 11 years old, and I would be 12 on November 1918. This is when I had the responsibility of a man, never a teenager. I went to the brickyard and asked for Mr. Chewy. I told him that I was the boy that Mr. Rouse should talk to him about. He asked me a few questions, if I had ever driven a team of horses before, and I told him that I had. But I think Mr. Rouse had told him about me and my family because he was very nice. He made me wait until everyone had left, and he showed me how to hook up a team of horses and put them to a dump wagon. He got on the seat and went with me and showed me how to drive and how to dump the wagon when it was full of clay. We had to cross two Reading Railroad tracks. I had to drive under the chute, and the man would open the chute, and the clay would come down and fill the dump wagon. He would close the chute, and I would pull away, and another wagon would pull under. Then we would take the clay to the brickyard. They had a large field there, and we would dump clay in the field. There was a man that would level the clay off. Mr. Chewy made two trips with me, and then he said, "Well, son, you're on your own. If you have any trouble, ask one of the other drivers, and they will show you." The left 45, we had to take our team of bars so he could reach. When I got to the barn, Mr. Chewy came and helped me unhook the horses from the wagon, and they would go to the trough and drink water and then go to their stalls all by themselves. Mr. Chewy was very nice to me. He was like a father to me. He was always there when I needed him. And believe me, I sure needed him. I was 11 years old and I was too small to put the harness on the horse. So he would put the harness on the horses every morning and take it off every night. My first pay for 2 weeks was $30.20. We were paid $20.60 an hour. But we worked 10 hours a day and 6 days a week. Sometimes we had to work overtime. That was a lot of money back in 1918, and we got paid in cash, gold and silver, and some paper money. I was so happy when I got my first pay that saved money to buy sugar, salt, flour, coffee, and oil. The rest of the food we raised was on the farm. Mr. Chewy did this for about a month. One night, when it was time to quit, he told me to wait until everyone went home. They wanted to talk to me. So they sat down and asked me how I would like to help them take care of the horses instead of driving. I would have to clean the stalls and put fresh hay and feed in the manger. He said he thought I would like it and he wouldn't have to hook and unhook the team for me. I said, "Mr. Chewy, whatever you say is okay, bye." Little did he know that I thought so much of him for taking the time with me. So the next Monday morning, I started working with Chewy in the barn. We got along very good. We had 33 horses and mules and 6 little ponies to take care of. Mr. Chewy lived right by the barn. He had a 2-room house. He was in charge of the horses. He had to make sure that they were well taken care of. At night he would have to go before he went to bed to see that everything was all right. I liked working with him. He didn't treat me like a boss. He would talk to me like he was my father. But he's never married, and all the men and boys that drove the horses liked him. I worked with him about a year, and then I thought I would like to work around the men in the yard making bricks. So I asked him if it was all right. He said yes, if that is what I wanted. So I started working in the yard with the men. It was hard work, but I liked it. It paid more money, and it was more interesting. They made all kinds of bricks from a plain mud brick to fancy bathroom bricks. I was quick in learning. I worked there steady for about 3 years. We were getting along fine. My mother and my brothers would work on the farm in summer, and when I came home from work at 4:30, I would go out on the farm and carry the baskets of potatoes and tomatoes home. My brothers were too small to carry them. Then I would take my shoe shine box, go over to the Winslow station to shine shoes until about 9 p.m. Then I would go home. Our house was the closest house to the brickyard and the station. We were surrounded by swamps and woods. About 2 years after my dad died, my sister got a job in a broom factory in Atco, New Jersey. It was about 5 or 6 miles from Winslow, and she had to go to work by train. I used to walk her to Pennsylvania Station in the morning about 5:30. My sister was only about 16 years old at the time. About the time my dad died in 1918 with the flu, there were a lot of people dying. One of my uncles and his 1-year-old son died. Their name was DeMaio. So about 1920, my mother married this man, Chineo. We didn't know him too well, but the people that knew him said that he didn't like to work and that he was very lazy. His wife worked on the farm to keep him. He would always say that he was sick and couldn't work. Me and my sister would go to work every day. My mother and my brothers would work on the farm. He would sit home and smoke a pipe and drink wine every day. I was getting very mad at him and my mother. I just couldn't get along anymore. I was about 15 years old now. And my mother and sister and brothers were getting along pretty good. So I decided to run away from home. The only place that I knew was Newark, New Jersey. I had 5 or 6 cousins there, and an uncle and aunt that I knew would make me feel at home. I saved about $10. And one night when they were all asleep, I packed my clothes and left home. I went to Newark, New Jersey to my cousin's house. I told him what had happened, and he said I should let my mother know where I was so she didn't want. I wrote my mother a letter and told her I was alright and not to worry. My cousin was working at Essex Iron Foundry in Newark, so he got me a job there. I thought the job in the brickyard was hard, but this job was a lot harder. They had these little iron cars to haul the pig iron from the freight cars to the plant. They would send the little cars with the pig iron up on an elevator about 3 feet from the bigel, the red hot tank that melted the pig iron. My job was to take the pig iron out of the cars and slide it down a chute in the furnace where it would melt. The pig iron weighed about 50 pounds. It was very hard work for a boy about 15 years old. This was about October 1921. I worked there until April 1922. It was too hot and hard, so I decided to go back home and work in the brickyard. I also missed my brothers and sister and my mother. I had to save my money. My cousin only charged me $10 a week room and board, so I had a couple of $100. When I got home, they all were glad to see me. We were all happy again, but we didn't like our stepfather. On Monday morning after I got home, I went to the brickyard for a job. I knew they would give me a job because I was a good worker and they knew my mother needed help. There was a man they called Tony Winnar, who was the boss of all the young boys that would drive all the horses in summertime. They gave me a job driving a team of horses. He had lost one of his arms in a clay crusher in the brickyard, so they made him a boss. He was a very nice man and I liked him. In summertime they were very busy and would work overtime on Sundays, but we would only get paid straight time. There was no time and a half in those days. In summertime they couldn't get help. Most of the men that worked there in the winter had farms. In the summer they would quit and work on the farms. In the winter they would come back to work. So in summer we would have to bring the clay in the shed so it would be dried for the winter. So I worked at the brickyard and I would go home at night and work on the farm. My uncle would plow the ground for us in April. We would take care of it the rest of the summer. I bought a little mule back from the brickyard for $35 so I could keep the grass down in the farm. He was very stubborn, and I couldn't do too much work with him, but I kept him until November after the summer. About the last of November, they didn't need all the horses in the brickyard. They would keep about 25. They would sell 8 or 10. They would take them to the auction in Vinland, New Jersey. That is about 18 miles from Windsor. Mr. Chewy asked me if I would like to take some of the horses to the sale in Vinland. I said I would like to, and I asked him if it was all right to take my little mule to the sale. He said, sure, if you want to. So on a Saturday morning at 5 a.m., me and 2 other boys took 6 horses and my mule, and we left for Vineland. We each rode a horse and had a horse tied to the one we were riding, but I also had my mule. We got to Vineland about 12 or 1 p.m., and Mr. Chewy was there. He had a Chevy car. He drove his car there so he could take us home after he sold the horses. The auction started at 1 p.m. They sold all the horses. A drunken man bid $40 on mule, so the auctioneer sold them. At 3 p.m. the sale was over. Mr. Chewy got all his money, and when I went to get my $40, this man that bid on the mule said that he bid on it. So I was left with the mule. The auctioneer said I could leave him there till next Saturday, but it would cost me $1 a day. Mr. Chewy said it was up to me, so I decided to take the mule home. Mr. Chewy and the 2 boys left. This was about 4 p.m. I put the bridle on the mule and I started walking. I walked about 12 miles until I got out of town. I didn't want to ride him in town. There was too much traffic, and I'd never rode him before. When I got out of the town on a side road, I thought now I could ride him. His name was Pete. So I got on his back and said, oh, hey Pete, let's go. He went about 20 feet and threw me off. So I walked about 15 or 20 feet and I got on his back. He went about 20 feet and off. I went again. I wasn't getting anywhere, so I walked about a mile. I tried to ride him again, but it was no use. Old Pete wasn't going to let me ride him, so I decided I would make better time by walking him home. We walked about 5 miles to Blaine. It was getting dark, so I tried to ride him again, but it was no use. I would talk to him nice and pet him, but as soon as I got on his back, he would throw me off. We walked about 5 or 6 miles more until I got to the Black Horse Pike. The pike wasn't built then, and the Pennsylvania Railroad that ran from Philadelphia to Wildwood crossed the Black Horse Pike. When I got there, I was pretty tired, so I sat down and took a rest. I thought, as long as I can't ride Pete, I will walk along the railroad tracks. It would be a lot shorter than going to Hamilton and then to Winslow. The railroad track would take me about a half mile from my house, so I started to walk down the tracks. When I got about a mile down the tracks, there was a stream of water. There was a bridge about 20 feet long. Railroad ties were about 5 or 6 inches apart. The mule stopped. He would cross the bridge. I tried everything to make him cross. But as they say, a stubborn mule, he sure was. I was so mad I was going to push him down the bank and walk. But I had to turn and go back about a mile to the Black Horse Pike at 12th Street. I had to walk to Hamilton and then to Winslow. I got home about 6:30 on Sunday morning. That was the longest walk I ever had. I walked the 18 miles in 15 hours. The walk wasn't too bad, but I had to pull Pete most of the way. I slept all day on Sunday. 2 weeks later, I sold Pete the mule to a man from Bull Anchor. I sold him with the wagon and the harness for $40. And that was the end of Pete the mule.
This podcast is brought to you by the Vitale family, produced by Courtney Vitale. Special thanks to Russell Vitale for listening to the audio and transcribing it, and to Cass Vitale for just being you. Mickey's voice in this podcast is an AI clone, so there may be some flaws in the audio. Regardless, we hope you find it engaging. Follow and subscribe to hear the next part of Mickey's adventures.
Oi Mari, quando giorneggiu verso te, fammi dormire una notte abbracciata con te. Oi Mari, quando giorneggiu verso te, fammi dormire. Oi Mari.